In this video lecture, we're going to be talking about organizational communication in the healthcare setting. So, first, I just want you to think about experiences you've had with healthcare. How many of you have had the experience of being in the hospital, whether it was in the ER or some other part of the hospital, and finding yourself waiting to get the attention of a nurse or a doctor or administrator who's busy talking to a colleague about a matter that's, clearly personal? Or how many of you have had the experience of being in a hospital and feeling that the caregivers were just not taking your problem as seriously as you felt they should? There are several reasons for this. One of the most important being that while you were there out of an emergency, something out of the ordinary in your life, the doctors, nurses, and administrators were there at their jobs. They're working. And in order to navigate work, they develop routines. They take their coffee breaks, just like you may in your internships or jobs. They talk to their colleagues and they gossip with friends, just as you might in your place of work. It just feels like they shouldn't because for us, this is our emergency. Which brings us to the second part of the equation, which is that there are studies that have been done that show that people who have to deal with unexpected things as part of their daily lives, they find a way of making routines of the unexpected. They also employ distancing techniques so that they don't burn out. If they got as worried as you are, well, that really actually wouldn't be great. You don't want that, and they don't want that. They wouldn't last very long in their job. Um, but out of primary concern for us today is to recognize that hospitals, doctors' offices, etc., are organizations, and they operate in the same way that other businesses operate. And so it's useful to have some basic understanding of the principles of organizational communication before we move forward. So the first thing to think about is that hospitals operate as hierarchical organizations, um, organizations that have designated pathways of communication and of power. And these are hierarchical in nature. So you've got that wonderful org chart there. In a hierarchical organization, there are different types of communication. There's downward communication, and this is communication that happens with subordinates, people who work under you. In comparison, we have upward communication, which is with your superiors, so your boss, your manager. You can also have horizontal communication, which is communication with peers. And then we think about how that communication takes place. Sometimes it takes place in formal networks. These are when we have the formal chains of command, supervisors to subordinates. Maybe we have emails, bulletin boards, newsletters, those formal networks of communication that an organization uses, maybe their website, direct calls. But then we also have informal networks. And these are places where messages travel through in day-to-day communication, friendship networks, rumor mill, gossip, all of that communication that is outside of the official designation of an organization. And so we think about this kind of communication and have to understand when we're dealing with these networks how it is that messages go from one place to the next. In a hospital setting, we have to think about this in particular ways because hospitals, healthcare, operate in the same principles. They tend to favor downward communication and stress the authority of those in power. There are good reasons for this. If you are in an emergency, you don't necessarily have time for a committee meeting and a voting of everyone's best ideas. There's a reason in the military that you have commanding officers. That kind of structure, particularly in conflict areas, can be important when you have to make split decisions. But there's a downside of that as well, which is that it often makes it really difficult for information from the lower positions of power to make it up to the people on the top. And when we think about patient care, this is hugely important. When people in higher levels of authority don't listen to people lower down, um, and we can think about this as doctors and nurses, for instance. When nurses are disempowered and they have more information about a patient than a doctor, we can lose important and valuable information that can have deadly consequences. We see this as well with residents who may not feel they have the power to speak up or they're not listened to. And it's really important when thinking about these communication systems, these organizational systems, how to facilitate opportunities and build into your processes ways to get feedback from people at different levels of an organization.